Gemistos Plethon was the last OG Hellenic pagan and the first pagan revivalist. He was one of the most respected thinkers in Christendom in the late 1300s and early 1400s. He was so into Plato that it was unironically argued he was possessed by him, and most importantly, he was a giver of elite-level side-eye. He was the subject of one of my earliest history shorts. Side note, but I do history shorts. Every week I tell a tale from history, sometimes about literature, myth, or cinema. So do check them out if you like my history stuff and wish you did more of that. Anyway, occasionally, like 4 times so far, I've taken a subject from one of my history shorts and I've expanded it into a full-length video. A history long. The name gets even less clever the more you think about it. So far, I've done Tom Harrison, the headhunting guerrilla fighter, Dorothy Gibson, the Titanic survivor and maybe Nazi spy, and Kurt von Hammerstein Accord, the man who tried to kill Hitler before it was cool. Plethon is my first non-World War II history long. Though with his career, it is possible he discovered the secret of immortality and decided to keep it secret. Georgios Gemistos was born in Constantinople. And why? That's no one's business but his parents, and possibly they might be giants. He had a well-educated Orthodox Christian background, and studied heavily both locally and in Adrianople. And when I say Orthodox, I meant both senses of the word. Adrianople was the new Ottoman capital. It had recently been conquered from the ailing Byzantine Empire. While not far away, Constantinople just kept ailing. The great city would fall shortly after Plethon's death. Clearly, he was a load-bearing philosopher. Adrianople, being the cosmopolitan crossroads between the Greek, Roman, and Muslim worlds, was a mini-melting pot, especially when it came to education. The works of the pagan philosophers had been kept alive in the Middle East, and it was there that Plethon first read the works of a man who changed his life forever, Plato. Plethon loved Plato, maybe more than Plato loved Socrates, and Plato almost single-handedly made Socrates the main character in Western philosophy. Plethon loved Plato so much that he added Plethon to his name to make it sound like Plato, or Platon in Greek. Of course, it also helped that Plethon also meant abundant, or full, of learning. Plato was too dead to fill him with anything else. When he returned from Adrianople, he threw himself into his work, establishing himself as a teacher and a judge, and even a senator for a time. Yes, a senator. Byzantium was the direct continuation of the ancient Roman Empire. He was an actual Roman senator in the 1300s. Eventually, though, Emperor Manuel II sent him to Mystery in modern-day Greece, where he'd base himself for most of the rest of his career. In those days, people knew less, and so it was perfectly reasonable for a man to become a world-class expert in philosophy, history, mathematics, and more, if he really wanted to. And Plethon did. He wrote and wrote and wrote, becoming more and more famous. He would also teach, attracting such notable students as Cardinal Bessarion, who in my history video cinematic universe you might have seen in the Conclave, being one of the guys who didn't vote to seat the legendary mad lad Pope Pius II. Bessarion was one of the high-profile Orthodox figures to escape to Rome after the fall of Constantinople. One quick conversion to Catholicism later and he became a cardinal. Another student was the amazingly named Gennadius Scholarius. He sounds like an evil nerd invented by J.K. Rowling. Scholarius would become the first Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople after its fall to the Ottomans. He was chosen for the job because there was a big push to reunify the church after the fall of the city, and he was one of the few high-ranking Orthodox figures left in the city who hated Catholicism more than he hated being conquered by the Muslims. He also hated Plethon. A third student was the nearly impossible to say, if you're me, Leonicus Shokokandeles, apparently it means copper fist, an important historian who gave one of the big accounts of the fall of Constantinople. But like I said, between learning all this stuff and teaching, Plethon's cachet was rising, and eventually he was sent to Italy to take part in the Council of Florence, accompanied by another notable student, Mark of Ephesus, a bishop and now considered one of the 3 pillars of orthodoxy. The Council of Florence was a series of discussions about reunifying the Catholic and Orthodox churches. It was a project by Byzantine Emperor John VIII, who realized that the writing was on the wall. The Ottomans were going to take Constantinople, and not seeing all the Christians to the west as a bunch of heretics might improve their chances of surviving. Here's the weird part. The council succeeded. They agreed reunification. They came up with ways to merge Orthodox and Catholic traditions. They signed a document. The Pope in Rome, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Byzantine Emperor were all behind that. So what went wrong? Well, a couple of things. A, that Patriarch died right after signing the agreement. And B, two guys called Mark of Ephesus and Gemistos Plethon.
Surprise!
After the death of the Patriarch, Mark was one of the biggest names on the Orthodox side, and he concluded that the Catholics were still a bunch of heretics, and this is why he's one of the pillars of Orthodoxy. And when the delegation returned to Constantinople, they discovered that the people were against it. Now usually the emperor would be able to crush some peasants and a bishop, and Plethon, but I'll get back to him. But the empire was crumbling. Constantinople was less the centre of the Orthodox world, and more somebody made suggestions.
Sir, a lot of people are stroking their guns.
Also, it has been brought to my attention that a number of you are stroking guns. Therefore, I will step aside and open up the floor.
So, reunification fell apart, the churches stayed separate, and Constantinople fell within decades. But what about Plethon? Well, Plethon had his own religious reasons for opposing it, but before I go into that, I'd like to chat about his side hustle in Florence. You see, the host of the council was one Cosimo de' Medici, a very rich and historically important man. And Plethon got to doing what he did, teaching, giving lectures where he explained how Plato rules and Aristotle drools. You see, Aristotle's work was known in Europe at the time, but Plato had been lost until now. And Cosimo de' Medici was one of the people who attended his lectures. Whether they actually met or not is kind of unclear, but Plethon had a huge influence on Medici, who took what he learned and founded the Platonic Academy of Florence, which would be one of the cornerstones of what became the Renaissance. Yes, helping kickstart the Renaissance was Plethon's side hustle. So why did Plethon oppose reunification? Two reasons. A, his public one, that wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. He was an ardent nationalist, and reunification would risk the Greeks coming under the yoke of the rest of Europe. The irony here is the Greeks he's talking about were also Romans, and he didn't want to risk being ruled from Rome. Weird shit can happen when you have a 1400-year-old empire that moved its capital to a whole new continent. The second reason was that reuniting the churches would have strengthened Christianity, and Plethon believed that the Greeks, the Byzantines, the Romans, needed to re-embrace paganism. And seeing as they didn't do either, he might have had a point. Plethon was an ardent pagan, but not exactly the same as the ancient pagans. He couldn't be. Most of the knowledge of the exact nature of their beliefs and practices were lost. Hell, even today we're missing a hell of a lot. So he invented the idea of the pagan revival, and to aid this, he decided to do a one-man council in Nicaea on Hellenistic paganism, ancient Greek paganism, to help it survive against the organized forces of Christianity and Islam. Yeah, he didn't like Islam either. So he took what was known about paganism and took influences from Zoroastrianism, ironically the religion of ancient Persia, and merged them together with a smidge of Christian influence and a bunch of Neoplatonist thinking, and wrote his last great work, the Book of Laws, detailing this new, or rather old faith. Along with that perfect Plato-inspired society to go alongside it. It's kind of like Sparta by way of Marxism. And being Plethon, a guy so well respected, he was brought along to the Reunification Church Council and allowed a vote even though he had no theological rank. A man so sure of himself that he voted against the wishes of his emperor while he was in the room. He didn't make any great effort to hide any of this. There's a great quote from George of Trebizond, who was also at the Council of Florence. I heard him at Florence asserting that in a few more years the whole world would accept one and the same religion with one mind, one intelligence, one teaching. And when I asked him, Christ's or Muhammad's, he said, neither, but it will not differ much from paganism. George also said that he heard from people who knew him that Plethon had predicted the collapse of Christianity and Islam not long after his death, and that his paganism would rise. Anyway, he lent copies of his Book of Laws to his students and just requested that they keep it quiet until after his death, which they did. Plethon died in 1452, 1 year before the fall of Constantinople. When the manuscript was discovered 8 years after his death, it was taken to Princess Theodora, whose husband ruled Myrna. She was ordered by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Scholarius, who'd come to hate his old teacher, to burn at. But she refused because Plethon was such a highly regarded thinker. So Scholarius burned it himself, and the main reason we know it existed is because he wrote heavily about how much he hated it. So, what was his paganism like? Well, we have fragments of it, thanks to Scholarius quoting it heavily while writing about how much he hated it. The summary survived too because it was in the possession of Cardinal Bazarian. He wasn't a pagan, but he seems to have been a bit pagan curious. All that and a couple of other pieces have allowed scholars to reconstruct some stuff. And it's interesting. The gods aren't rambunctious twerps of traditional Greek myth. They're all perfect, bodiless forms rather than powerful people. Zeus is the uncreated ruler of all who created the other gods. Poseidon is his motherless son, the second most powerful and ruler of the heavens. And then there's Hera, creator of all that is indestructible. So, Captain Scarlet. Which kind of makes sense when you remember that Cloudbase is in the heavens and the Mysterons are immaterial. As well as the powerful Olympians there, he had lesser gods like the Tartarans, who were led by Kronos. They rule the mortals. There's celestial gods led by Helios, who rule the sky. And there were demons, who, like all the other gods, major and minor, are good, not evil. Their point is to push humanity towards divine order. People are reincarnated at the will of the gods. And there's no escape from reincarnation like in Buddhism, because it's not suffering that's keeping you being born. Humans are a bond between the mortal and the divine, and the cycle of birth and rebirth are simply part of the cosmic balance controlled by the gods, like magnetism or the behavior of ants. Actual examples he used. Some years after Plethon's death and outing as a big old pagan, an Italian nobleman broke into his tomb in Mistis and stole his body, because he felt that the great philosopher would prefer to rest among quote-unquote free people rather than in Ottoman lands. He dragged the body all the way to Armenian Italy, and he's now entombed in the cathedral. Because clearly what the world's biggest Greek nationalist and pagan clearly wanted was to be buried in a cathedral in Italy. All I can say is that guy is very lucky that Plethon was far too busy being reincarnated to haunt him. Although, to be fair, the cathedral in Rimini sometimes gets called pagan, because the prince who was in charge of its construction preferred ancient Roman aesthetics over traditional Catholic ones. Anyway, to cap this off with some fun, Plethon thought that homosexuality was bad, and that gay people should be burned alive. So apparently he missed day one of how to be an ancient Greek pagan. You know what they say, you can take the philosopher out of the medieval Orthodox Christianity, but you can't take the medieval Orthodox Christianity out of the philosopher. And that was the tale of Gemistos Plethon, a fascinating figure of the 13 and 1400s. Hope you enjoyed. Give us a like, a sub, all that good stuff. And if you've got someone I did a short on that you'd like to learn more about, just leave a comment. Maybe I'll give them along. And if you have some extra coppers and you really love what I do, please consider checking out the Patreon. It's the main reason I can continue doing videos.